Why art? Why do I do what I do? Because I have to. You know, there's no other reason anyone would do this unless they had to. I think there's something about the artistic process that you get to a point towards the completion of a work and something just happens. And this is kind of like endorphin moment in your brain. It's kind of like an abstract pleasure that happens and you essentially become addicted to it. As the artist, we are #1 critics. It's a big kind of a title to live up to because you're entrusted with culture and promoting that culture. Out of that pressure, that tension, that's where my work tends to come from. You can't reinvent your life until you've lived your life. And I've had enough life where now I can actually resource that material and put it into my work. My name is Francks Deceus, and I prefer to go by Deceus. I find it to be more functional. I'm initially from Haiti. I'm actually one of 5 brothers. My parents immigrated to the US in the 70s. I then came later on in the 70s, so 75 to be exact. A ripe old age of 9 years old, ready to see the world through a whole nother lens, sort of say. In terms of other artists in my family, I also have a twin brother, a fraternal twin. He seems to be very passionate about image making, photographs, and outside of that, I have an uncle who's no longer alive. He's deceased. In Haiti, was a carpenter, and there would be wood carvings on the coffins and stuff like that. So he did stuff like that. And that's about the only memory I have of anyone in the family being an artist or pursuing art or artistic in any kind of regard. You have to understand people viewed art as a luxury, and in some cases people still do. So people are more about survival and maintaining their family, subsistence, and things of that nature. So art was kind of like never really encouraged. Even in my own practice, art wasn't really encouraged in my household. It was because of a professor, actually an art teacher of mine, who kind of saw my excitement for art and gave me an easel, a watercolor set, and some paper, literally, you know. And he's like, and you know, do whatever you want, enjoy them, da 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 da. And little did I know, and little did anyone else know, that I was gonna just head first into this material. Again, without any real trajectory, any long-term plan or vision. I just knew instantly that this was something I liked, and I had this kind of intuitive connection to it, and it sort of made its own way to the present. Well, my culture tends to influence my work in, I guess, multiples of ways. Being that I left Haiti old enough where I could remember a lot of my cultural ideology and speaking Creole at home and eating rice and beans. It sounds mundane or whatever, but it ingrained a sense of connectivity and even later on a sense of pride, because we're all trying to, I guess, self-actualize. And what are those things based on? Having that kind of root and cultural attachment associated with my upbringing, associated with my identity. I had a very strong idea of who I was. And as a young Black teen in an urban setting, the temptation of distractions was something that you had to deal with pretty much every day. That home base was instrumental in terms of everything, you know, the decisions you made, the paths you traveled, and the results that ultimately came out of all of that. I didn't formally study art. At school, I went to Long Island University, had a BA in sociology, but I took a lot of art classes because it was a natural interest for me. But my focus, oddly enough, was printmaking, based on the classes that I took. And also after graduation, I actually studied printmaking at Robert Blackburn's studio. It's a very famous printmaking facility here in Manhattan. I took under the wings of Otto Neal, is another artist who's maybe in his 80s now. Otto had a class on Friday nights to come and learn etching, and for free. And so everyone was like, I'm going. I started going Friday nights, making etchings, and then kept up with that. Eventually had a residency abroad at another printmaking facility in France, actually, where I went for a month-long residency making lithos, and it was stone lithos. And I had very little experience at the time with stone lithos, but it was a natural, again, process. I think there's something about the artistic process that you get to a point towards the completion of a work and something just happens, you know, and this kind of like endorphin moment in your brain. It's kind of like this abstract pleasure that happens, and you essentially become addicted to it. And in a lot of ways, it's an addictive drug, or in terms of synonymous to that kind of format or feeling. You become subdued by it and seduced by it, and it rewards you as you get deeper and deeper into it, and the satisfaction becomes more and more rewarding. And so it's kind of a cycle, you know. In some cases a vicious cycle, in some cases a very pleasurable cycle, but it's a cycle, you know, and it takes its own course. Oddly enough, I never did pretty much anything else. Right after school, after graduation, I was already painting my last few years of school, at least formatively, in terms of trying to kind of figure out if this is something I even wanted to do. With my degree, my work options were relegated towards teaching at local schools, things of that nature, but it just didn't fall into place for me. My real determination wasn't necessarily there, I would say. I didn't have a studio at the time. I was working from home. I roommated with two of my brothers, and I would paint in the living room in the corner, literally, finding my pattern, my voice, and all that other stuff. I've always had interest in art. I've always been, you know, creative and all that, and I have this connectivity, but I never necessarily saw myself as an artist. Much later on, I guess after I got to the point where things started to make sense and all that stuff, through the introduction of a friend, was able to secure this studio space that I'm in now. And this is almost 20 years ago. I think it was after that, maybe a couple years after that, really, you know, meeting some dealers, meeting some gallery people, meeting some curators, and started to really work differently. And I would say that's when, and even today, I don't necessarily see, you know, it's a big kind of a title to live up to, because you're entrusted with culture and promoting that culture. Brooklyn is just such a loaded statement in itself, because I've seen so many different Brooklyns. When I first moved here, we lived in part of Brooklyn that could be considered Little Haiti. And so there was a record store down the block, you heard Haitian music. There was a Haitian restaurant on this side, you can smell the food. There was grocery stores, and so it didn't feel like Brooklyn, except that it was Brooklyn. And then we moved again to Crown Heights, and there was a mixture of African-American, Caribbean, and Hasidic Jews. And that was a whole nother Brooklyn. And then I got older, I moved to another part of Brooklyn, whereas by now I'm an adult, and so I see Brooklyn in a whole new light. And it's kind of the same answer. It's a collection of all these experiences. So Brooklyn as an experience has ebbed and flowed and weaved its way into my process, my thinking, my ideology. I don't know about now, but 20 years ago, when you went, let's say, California or down south or wherever, and then you say, "Oh, where are you from?" And then you say Brooklyn. They're like, "Oh, really?" And people, for some reason, had this affinity for the borough in a way that I couldn't understand, and to this day still don't understand. But there was something that happened here that, in terms of proximity and exposure to different perspectives and cultural dynamics, that is very unique to an area like this. Because if, again, you go to California, everyone's in cars. If you go to Atlanta, everyone's in cars. If you go to Miami, everyone's in cars. In New York and Brooklyn, where I'm from, where I currently live, this constant exchange and friction and exposure, it's a transformation that happens in real time. And it happens in a way that it really gives you that perspective, and a very unique perspective on the world. Where I currently live, I hear Russian, I hear Polish, I hear Caribbean twang and patois, and I hear English. And then you smell various foods and da-da-da-da. There's not too many places you could say that, you know? And so Brooklyn is definitely that kind of melting pot in a way that really infused so many different textures and perspectives. And as an artist, someone who's already hyper alert and always looking for the next trigger or the next thing, is like, you know, it's just perfect in some ways. The physical space allowed me to have mental space, and the mental space really allowed me to really investigate my thoughts and ideas in a way that I wasn't able to do before, because there was just so much distraction in my environment. Here, when I come, my routine requires, or typically, a 15-minute meditation, sit down and look at my sketchbooks and look at ideas and kind of wait for it, you know. Next thing you know, ding, a little bell goes off, and that's my marching orders for the day. To me, there's always this kind of guilt and obligation. I feel that I always need something to show for the day. So I would come in here, I would open the sketchbook, just start drawing idea. Even if it's reworking an existing idea, because there's a lot of ideas still left in that idea, sort of thing. And this is how a series of work kind of tend to develop, because you make one painting, but you turn it this way, it automatically starts saying something totally different. And you quickly realize, wow, there's at least 2 or 3 more paintings inside this one painting. These are some of the things that were able to happen in here in this space, because I had room. I can spread things out, I can hang them side by side, I can step back, I can visualize. Whereas prior to having a space, I just really couldn't get into those kind of mechanics. Why do I do what I do? Because I have to. You know, there's no other reason anyone would do this unless they had to. Because it comes with such ebb and flow, and you have periods of, you know, robust and abundance, and then periods of serious drought and doubt, you know. Normal life requires stability and predictability as a family man and father. Responsibility, financial responsibility, is something that really is at odds with creativity, because creativity doesn't always pay the bills. It's a juggle. It's a constant juggle. What I'm working on at the moment, and in particular for this show that's coming up, is the works that I've been working on almost a year and a half now. Pre-pandemic and during pandemic and remotely and social distancing. I found that the events of the last year, it was like a distilling process. It really allowed me to focus on the world and then bring it down to a finite point, sort of say. And the work I'm currently working on is titled Mumbo Jumbo. It's deliberately amusing of a title, but it's definitely very loaded in meaning and in depth. The work is kind of rooted in my own experiences as a Haitian and an immigrant in America, and navigating all the nuances that came with that whole experience. Coming from this kind of outside perspective into the fray of an urban context, in my particular case would be Brooklyn, New York. There was a lot of expectations and a lot of disillusionment. As a kid, I believed the American dream was kind of set in stone, and it was something that you can actualize the minute you got here, because the streets were allegedly paved in gold. There was no gold. And so it was kind of like, and this kind of served as a bigger picture for, I guess, current climate. You still have a lot of immigrant populations still coming here, and yet there's a lot of political strife around immigration and policies being set in place and constantly in flux. The work is looking to kind of address some of these issues in terms of policy and reality, while maintaining your inner self. And how do I maintain cultural ties to my Haitian heritage and yet my immediate urban setting, sort of say. And so it's a combination of all these things and even some more. Mumbo Jumbo is also a title from a book that I read last year. Well, I wouldn't, it was a very academic read, so it was a wrestling match, actually. At the end of it, I was able to deduce enough information from the book where it really applied to what I was working on. The title really tried to address the complexity of the African American experience, and which is why I was pretty drawn to it, because offhand, it doesn't sound like it's such a heavy set of material, but in reality, it really was. And it really had a lot of Haitian referencing and Loas and voodoo and this, so I found it very interesting, and it really gave me another contextual layer to apply to the work. The piece that I want to talk about in reference to the show is a bit of a departure. Well, I asked myself a question first. What would the work look like if I just start like cutting it up and pulling it apart, and so in doing so and trying to answer that question, I started making this kind of montage, assemblage, built up soft sculpture kind of formation. And in this case, I'm really isolating the central figure in the painting, opposing to all the other additives that come with it. Taking large roll of canvas and pretty much layering it and stitching it and painting it and cutting it into the shape of the hose and the spray, just to really focus the whole kind of grouping of works around this kind of central theme, but also taking it into a whole nother dimension, almost three-dimensional format. Even though it's still going to hang on the wall, I think it's a very interesting point of entry, point of intrigue for people coming into the show to kind of have something to bounce off and cross-reference. I think it's always good to push your ideas as far as you can. Some are going to work and some are not. And so a lot is discovered in that process, and I've had enough opportunities and experiences over the years to really trust that process. You don't necessarily need to know the final result of every idea, because a lot of times you won't know until you actually embark on that idea. And this is an instance where I'm so over the moon of the fact that I tried it. It was actually encouraged by Jumani. He's like, let's see what you can do, swing for the fences, take the opportunity, run with it. And I was like, wow, that's very encouraging and reassuring. It gave me the freedom to kind of just let my hands go. And it's an idea that I had in the back of my mind, rotating, but I didn't really have an opportunity for it. It's hard to tell from the piece. It's 7 feet by 7 feet. It does require a lot of material, even though it may not look like it immediately looks like a lot of material. But I was very happy to have the opportunity and the encouragement to even try it. And so far, I'm very happy with the way it's coming out. And I can't wait for it to be finished. Jumani first approached me about 2 years ago, I believe. We kind of started a random conversation over Instagram about Ed Clark, who had recently, at that point, had just passed away. And so there was this kind of connection. But more so just the attitude, the confidence, and the fact that he's doing something that wasn't relegated to him, in terms of, you would not expect typically Jumani would be directing a gallery and that has major footprint in the area. It's relatively a new relationship, but it's definitely off to a great start, and especially the confidence he's encouraged in terms of me pushing myself artistically and going for it, because a lot of galleries don't do that. Okay, this is what you've been doing, that was working, let's stick with that. And he was like, no, go for it. And I was like, all right. And so it was a really good thing. You feel like invigorated and charged. And so I'm excited about the show. I can't wait for the show. I'm curious to see how the whole thing is gonna, because it's here in my head as an idea, and then it's here as these paintings. What does it look like there on the walls as a show? So from idea to painting to a show is 3 different hurdles. So I'm definitely curious, looking forward to it. I'm excited about it. And hopefully people can really get that thing I'm hoping that they get. Rooted in my experience as a Black man, a Haitian immigrant raised in an urban context in the United States of America, I explore the tensions between self-actualization, social structures through conceptual, abstract, and figurative paintings, collage, and drawings. I examine the layered experience of identity with an understanding of myself as a human being, an immigrant, and a racialized body. The negotiation of power dynamics rooted in historical systems and practices generates a particular type of pressure on both myself and other bodies of color, one that impedes our existence, our livelihoods, our ability to move freely within society. This pressure is embodied visually in the loaded symbolism of the hose, most notably a tool of violence in the civil rights movement, which act as the central antagonists in most of my recent body of work, Mumbo Jumbo.